Continuing to episode 6, on their way to the elf forest, Goblin Slayer and the others were attacked by rocks falling from both cliffs that squeezed them. Fortunately, Priestess Girl managed to use her protection magic to minimize the impact. She was confident they could endure if it was just these rocks. However, the assailant was not limited to that. As suspected, goblins were the masterminds behind this attack. It seemed they had also prepared arrows for assault. The elf retaliated with her arrows as well. Goblin Slayer then asked the lizardman to take control of the raft. Meanwhile, Goblin Slayer finally used the javelins he had prepared earlier. Then, the dwarf summoned the Undine Spirit to accelerate the raft's speed. Goblin Slayer began throwing his javelins. Unfortunately, he could only rely on luck when attacking from under the river. He didn't know the number of goblins, and it was unlikely he could kill them all. So their current goal was simply to escape, not to exterminate the goblins. Yes, even though Goblin Slayer didn't particularly like it, he had no other choice at the moment. Rocks and tree branches continued to fall from the cliffs. Fortunately, Priestess Girl could still withstand using her protection magic. Not far from there, they saw that the river flow had been blocked by wooden debris. Apparently, the goblins had planned to submerge passing boats. When their raft stopped, the goblins continued to pelt them with stones and wood. The dwarf had an idea to control Undine to lift the raft, allowing Goblin Slayer and the elf to attack the goblins from a distance. However, it seemed their raft was not lifted high enough to pass the wooden dam. At that moment, Priestess Girl remembered that she had learned the Purify spell. Luckily, there was some tannic auric visible in the dam, meaning she could use her magic there. Relying on Purify, the wooden barriers blocking the river flow were also cleaned by Priestess Girl's magic. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the lizardman used his roaring magic to scare the goblins momentarily. If possible, Goblin Slayer would search for the goblin nest and eliminate them. In the late afternoon, they finally emerged from the cliff squeeze and reached the forest area. They decided to take a break. Because their clothes were soaking wet, the girls immediately put on the bikinis they bought when they stopped in Watertown. After that, the girls left the changing room. Although the lizardman didn't understand the beauty of scaleless skin, he also felt the girl's appearance was good. And of course, Goblin Slayer noticed their appearance. Priestess Girl felt embarrassed about it. When asked for his opinion by Farm Girl, Goblin Slayer said he didn't really understand fashion, but he felt their appearance was suitable. Farm Girl immediately complained, hoping that Goblin Slayer would learn a little to understand women's feelings. However, Receptionist Girl stated that Goblin Slayer's current attitude was sufficient. After that, the elf tried to catch fish in the river with her arrows. The farm girl was amazed at adventurers like the elf. She became envious of adventurers who often went to places like this. Priestess Girl and the elf didn't approve of it. Sometimes, adventurers had to go to places that made their bodies muddy and smelly. This time, they happened to come to the wedding of the elf's sister. Meanwhile, Goblin Slayer, the dwarf, and the lizard man were preparing some things for bedding and meals later. The dwarf asked if it wasn't dangerous to let the girls play in the river. However, Goblin Slayer intentionally let the girls, especially the elf, relax. After all, this was her hometown. The lizardman said that Goblin Slayer was like a Mayashura. Goblin Slayer, of course, didn't know what that word meant. It seemed that a Mayashura was someone attentive even though their appearance didn't suggest so. By the way, the lizardman didn't mind letting the girls play either. At this point, they had entered the territory of the forest inhabitants. Goblins shouldn't be able to enter here indiscriminately. As evening approached, they all gathered around the bonfire to cook the catch. Priestess Girl then asked the elf if her hometown was close. The elf replied that they were on the border between the forest and the village. The villagers might come to pick them up. The farm girl imagined that the elf bride would be very beautiful. The elf agreed, proud of her sister's beauty. Not only that, the elf also talked about her brother. Goblin Slayer didn't expect the elf to have a brother. It turns out the brother in question is her sister's cousin who was the groom. She said her cousin was very arrogant, but he really liked her sister. The elf also didn't know why her sister liked her cousin back. The elf mentioned that elves like to sing when they are dating. However, there was a funny incident. Instead of sending love song lyrics, her brother sent a heroic poem to her sister. The cousin was immediately beaten and corrected by her sister. They continued to tell stories and jokes. Hearing the elf's story, Goblin Slayer also felt nostalgic for his hometown. Goblin Slayer was still awake as he had the duty to keep watch until morning. In the morning, an elf man approached Goblin Slayer. He warned that this area was close to the elf residence. Due to the noise, lizardmen and dwarf, who were sleeping nearby, woke up. Seeing this combination, the elf man realized they were adventurers. and likely they were the adventurers who fought goblins yesterday. It turned out the elves had finished off the remaining goblins left yesterday. Then, there was one thing that made the elf man curious. There was an elf tribe arrow stuck in the goblins. He asked what happened to that elf. Goblin Slayer showed that the elf was inside the tent. Then, the elf man boldly entered the tent where the girls were sleeping. They were awakened because of that. And it turned out the elf realized that the man was his cousin. He thought his cousin came to pick them up. Nevertheless, the current situation was not appropriate. The sleeping girls were wearing minimal clothing, and they screamed because it felt like being spied on. After packing up to leave, they were all escorted by the elf cousin to the elf village. He apologized to the elf because he had to go home even though he had just started adventuring. The elf cousin felt that the elf was becoming more like a commoner. He also didn't expect to meet Orkbolg in person, whom he had heard of. Goblin Slayer then asked why there were goblins nearby. The elf cousin said that recently the weather had been hot, so creatures like them appeared more frequently. It turned out by recently he meant 10 years. Since the demons appeared some time ago, many creatures had become like that. Hearing his statement, Priestess Girl asked Receptionist Girl if the elf race also didn't care much about goblins. According to Receptionist Girl, the elves ignored goblins not because they were considered harmless, but because they focused more on the scale of the problems at hand. Moreover, the elves were a race that had directly experienced that era, the era of wars among the gods. There were demons, dragons, evil gods, demon kings, and various creatures coming from other dimensions. Compared to all those creatures, goblins were nothing. The elf cousin stated that there was another creature that worried him more than goblins. That creature had reached near the village. The creature in question is an ancient being that resides in the forest. Elves are usually warned not to deal with them. Because the living area of elves and that creature are different, the creature rarely appears. It seems the elf also heard about that creature. He didn't expect that they really existed. The elf cousin had seen its footprints several times, and he said their grandfather had seen the actual figure of that creature when he was still young. Who knows how many years ago when their grandfather was still young. Not long after that, they finally arrived at the elf village. Lizardman's hometown was also in the forest, but he felt this place had a different charm. They were invited to enter the house of the elf and his male cousin. The elf cousin had prepared a bath and lunch. The girls decided to take a bath first, but the elf chose to stay. Who knows, her sister might come. The dwarf and lizardman decided to eat first, while Goblin Slayer wanted to unpack their belongings. He stayed alert in case goblins came. The only ones left in the house were Goblin Slayer and the elf. Suddenly, a long-haired elf woman with white hair came over to them. The woman was the elf's older sister. Just arrived, the elf sister scolded the elf for casually placing her underwear. She apologized for her sister's behavior to Goblin Slayer. She also heard that the man in front of her was Orkbolg. Like the elf cousin, she didn't expect his appearance to be different from the song she had heard. Not far behind the elf's sister, Goblin Slayer realized there was an elf girl who was not unfamiliar to him. He approached the elf and said that he had slaughtered them all. The elf explained that they had saved the elf girl from the ogre leading the goblins. From the elf's story, her sister understood that her sister was satisfied with her adventure. When satisfied, the elf sister asked her sister to stop adventuring. She knew her sister was facing danger and only getting a little money. She also asked why her sister was with someone like Orkbolg. Unlike in the songs, Orkbolg turned out not to be a hero but just an ordinary person. The elf replied that she never felt bored being around Goblin Slayer. Suddenly, a rumbling sound was heard in the distance. Large trees fell along with the sound. Quickly, Goblin Slayer came and threw the bow and arrows belonging to the elf. It turned out that the creature causing the trees to fall was a large, gray-colored creature. The creature had a long neck. Previously, Goblin Slayer had heard stories about elephants from the elf. Because its characteristics were similar, he immediately assumed that the creature was an elephant.